Thank you very much, Carol. I guess the check's in the mail. Thank you very much, Ed and others, for organizing this tonight, and thank you very much, all of you, for coming out. I'm going to start in terms of regional growth strategy and the regional sustainability strategy with just a little bit of history, because I think it's relevant. Regional planning is not new in British Columbia. It actually existed in the 1940s in some fashion. In 1965, the province established regional districts and established regional planning authority. And it was prescriptive. There was some clear power of the regional districts and there were powers of the municipalities. But what they found was that a lot of conflicts occurred. Sometimes the municipalities didn't like the fact that the regional district was essentially telling what to do and overriding their plans. In fact, Saanich and the Capital Regional District wound up in court over whether or not Tillicum Mall would be established. I think you can guess who won. In any case, in 1985, the province felt that this wasn't working and the legislation was rescinded and regional planning disappeared in our area, in fact in the province. Well, I think eventually people realized that some sort of regional planning absolutely had to happen. You know, if you had an area such as Victoria and Vancouver area where you had a whole collection of municipalities, everybody off doing their own thing, it's going to be a mess. Under the government of the day, I believe it was the NDP government, and the minister, I believe, was Darlene Mazzeri at that time, regional planning in terms of regional growth strategies was reintroduced. But they didn't want to repeat the same error, you know, that had caused the conflict before. So what they did was try to make it a cooperative effort amongst the participating municipalities, where they would get together and they would come to an agreement about what would happen in terms of their region for the future. And of course, that has the strength of avoiding conflicts. And it has the weakness of just how do you go about herding cats? It's got the weakness that here you have these independent municipalities with their own goals and ambitions and a variety of different politicians and so forth. How do you get them to put on a municipal or regional hat, rather, and recognize that they have to come to an agreement about how their region will be sustainable? So today we dance that dance. You know, it's kind of like, I compare it to a bunch of people living in a house, and it's communal, and they're sharing the house, and they each have a bedroom. Some things should be left up to each individual in the bedroom. I mean, we don't want to tell you what color to paint your walls, you know, or what posters you can and can't put up, racy or not. But we do want to be able to say, if you think that you can play your stereo full bore at 3 o'clock in the morning, that the rest of us don't think that's so good an idea. You know, so you need that balance. You know, we have a lot of talk right now today about amalgamation. And amalgamation is the wrong answer to a very real problem. And the problem is, how do you establish the regional framework for sustainability and then allow local governments to flesh that framework out and, you know, like their bedroom, do their part of it. On some issues, we find that easy to do regionally. And things like the water district. We understand that it makes sense to have one group organizing and controlling the water supply for this region. And so we have, well, we actually have two, but the primary one is the Regional Water Commission. I'm a commissioner, and you know, we set the policy for the entire region, and it works. And we wholesale water to municipalities, and then they retail it to their individual citizens. So the basic framework, the basic structure is set regionally, and then the decisions about what you do in your municipality once you buy the water from us is left up to you. The other things, and the big one is that when you look at establishing the framework for a region, how it's going to work, the skeleton, the structure, the foundation, you're really talking about land use and transportation. They are the fundamental structure, the foundation of any region. The land use choices you make and the transportation choices you make. And by the way, transportation is essentially an enabler of land use. You put a highway out to the western communities, you can guarantee you're going to have a lot of growth in the western communities. You don't put that highway in, you're not going to have that growth. It's an enabler. So you really want to be careful with transportation, what you're enabling. And the way to do it intelligently is to decide the land use that you want to have to start with. And then to go from there to say, okay, what transportation choices do we need to make to have that land use happen? That's the way you should go. There's the problem. Because land use decisions have traditionally been a municipal right. Municipalities make the decisions on land use. So they have been very hesitant to give up any of that power to the regional district. And we have regional plans. We've had the RGS for about 7 years now, getting close to. But it hasn't always been adhered to. And there hasn't been a lot of buy-in, in some cases, by municipalities. You know, the ideal situation would be to say, establish the skeleton regionally. Then give it to the municipalities and let them fill in their part, put the flesh on the bones, and do it the way they see best. Because municipalities do that better than the region, way better. The region has to be there to plan the essential structure you're doing. So, what happens and how a growth study is formed, essentially the region becomes the manager and coordinator for establishing a growth study. Somebody has to organize it, somebody has to manage it as it goes along. And that's the regional district. But essentially, and what the regional district does as a regional board, when you go through a growth study process, they look at what they intend to accomplish in broad strokes, such as we don't want to have further sprawl development. We want to preserve farmland. We want to preserve natural areas, and these kinds of things. And they draft a document called a regional growth strategy, or our next version, the regional sustainability strategy, and it sets out those broad principles of what you're trying to accomplish. Then each municipality is required, under provincial legislation, to come up with what is called a regional context statement. And that statement is intended to show how their official community plan, such as the one in Central Saanich here, will be consistent with the regional growth strategy. Now, it doesn't have to be consistent immediately. There is a recognition that you have a certain condition today. The regional growth strategy may be more ambitious, and it may take time to bring it into so that they are consistent with each other. But under provincial legislation, you must either show how your OCP, your official community plan, is consistent through your regional context statement, or you must show how it will become consistent over time. So you're not permitted to move backwards. If this is where the RGS is, and right now your OCP is only here, you are supposed to move it up to here. You can't move it down to there. You know, that's supposedly not allowed. So that's what the municipalities do. They come up with their context statements. Their context statements have to be accepted at the regional board level. And there has to be an agreement that that is acceptable to the other partners. And if it is not, then either the municipality can try again, or there can be an arbitration process set up by the provincial government. The other thing the region does in a regional growth strategy, it is supposed to monitor the regional growth strategy. So once it's in place, you know, and there it is, well, are people following it? You know, what's happening? What's going on? That was interesting for me in the last term because partway through the term, a couple of issues came up. One was here in Central Saanich, involving the co-op potential development near Butchers, the entrance to Butchers Garden, just down, I guess, West Saanich and Keating. And the other one was, and there were a number of other developments in Central Saanich, and the other one was out on the Juan de Fuca Marine Trail. A gentleman by the name of Enver Ilke had bought a large piece of property way out in the wilderness and was going to put pretty substantial development out there. I felt that either one or both of these were inconsistent with the regional growth strategy. So at the board level, I began to voice my concerns and try to get some action. It turned out that while the regional district board staff were responsible for monitoring the RGS, that's the regional growth strategy, they had no procedure for doing so. Absolutely none. Sort of saying, well, you know, what do we do with this? We're the manager, we're responsible. Well, there is no procedure in place. So fortunately, staff responded. We brought forward a procedure that would allow any individual director or group of directors to bring forward a concern that something that was happening in a member municipality was not consistent with the agreement that had been made. And you know, things progressed from there. I brought forward the issue of the co-op in Central Saanich and said, this should be reviewed. Not that it's right or wrong, but there is a legitimate concern and should be reviewed. And on that particular one, in the end, staff ruled that in their view, they felt it was inconsistent. It was supported by the board. Central Saanich appealed for provincial arbitration, and in the end, the arbitrator decided, in fact, it was inconsistent. And that Central Saanich, if they wish to do that, should seek an amendment to the regional growth strategy. Because no municipality, and this is where, by the way, regional growth strategies are absolutely binding on the regional district. The regional district is forbidden under law to do anything that is inconsistent with its regional growth strategy. The relationship with municipalities is not quite as clear, but what there is in the legislation, it says, once you have a regional context statement that's accepted, and others have said, that's fine, that's how you fit in the regional growth strategy, you cannot make a change in your OCP that is inconsistent with that regional context statement and the regional growth strategy. So if the municipality, individual municipality has said, this is what we will do. Here is our places where we are going to do development. These are the places that we will preserve. Then the municipality can't come in next year and say, oh, by the way, we've changed our mind. We think we'll put some development here where we're going to preserve. You can't do that. And if you try, you might get away with it if nobody's monitoring, but if the regional government is doing its job, then it will be tested as to whether or not that is consistent with what you said you were going to do. And if it isn't, and you rule that it isn't, then you can appeal to provincial arbitration and they will decide. So in the Central Saanich one, in that case, a couple of other Central Saanich developments were deemed to be consistent. Fine. You know, that was the end of that. The co-op was not. In the Juan de Fuca case, basically it was really going into quite a struggle, and essentially the voting group, it's a funny situation that the CRD eventually said, no, we think the public's right. We think this is inconsistent, and it was turned down. So things happened there, and the job was done. But I think it's worthwhile taking a look at what the province, you know, the province has this dance, this funny dance. We don't really want to give direct power to the regional district, but we do recognize what the regional planning process should accomplish. So I'd like to read out to you, just very briefly, some of the things that the province has indicated in its legislation and elsewise that it wants us to accomplish through regional planning. I think it will be germane. First of all, there is a section called minimum content. And here are some of the things that are required. 1, at least a 20-year planning horizon. 2, 20-year population and employment predictions. 3, a statement on the future of the region, including economic, social, and environmental objectives. And a couple more. But I think you get the sense there. The main point is this is intended to be long-range visionary planning. A minimum 20-year. And in some cases, the expectation is you are doing a plan that directs, in broad terms, where you want to go for the next 30 or 40 years. And that's critical. Because one of the things we've had down at the CRD board, and especially after the last election, we have a number of people who are saying, well, the past council shouldn't be able to bind us. That was the last council that signed that agreement. We don't like that. You know, we weren't council then. We think we should be able to do whatever we want. Well, you know, I understand that to a degree, but it is simply not workable. How can you have, it's like saying, well, I got married, but I think I should be able to fool around as much as I want. No, sorry, some people aren't going to like that. You know, you have, the critical thing of the regional process is you make this long-term commitment, just like a marriage. Can you amend it? Yeah. The basic amending process is not simple. Really complex process, and I think it should be complex. You know, if this is going to have any value, it's going to set out a vision. It's saying, this is what we're trying to become. This is what we need to become. And then you work towards it. We all know that in an election, you can get different types of councils. Some that I would, you know, call them perhaps renegade councils. And you just can't flip back and forth, depending on the flavor of the day or the flavor of the year. You know, it's not going to work. I remember when Carol mentioned I was president of North Quadra, and Hadji Treen is here, who's done a lot more for North Quadra than I ever did. But, you know, I used to say to people in land use decisions in North Quadra, you feel like you're the sheriff in a western town. And every few months, in comes a new gunslinger, quote, developer. And you've got to get every one, and only one of them has to get you. Because once it's done, it's done. And if you had this really valuable area you're trying to protect, and one guy beat you and got it through, it's gone. And it's gone forever. So it's the same thing with you're trying to protect things in your region. You've got to have that long-term commitment, and it has to survive successive councils. And to change it, because it's not entirely written in stone, things do change, but to change it should not be an easy process, at least for major changes. So the amendment process in regional growth strategy legislation is pretty difficult. You have to go through and what the amendment will be and so forth, but then it goes out to the member councils, all 13 of them, and you have to get unanimous consent. Not easy, you know, and as soon as you get one council that votes against it, then an arbitration process kicks in. Now, there's some risk in that. You know, the province gets to appoint the arbitrator, depends on what, well, you agree, but there's a risk that given the nature of the provincial government of the day, you don't know what's going to happen. But it's still not an easy process. There is, by the way, now a process for, or allowed process under provincial legislation recently, where you can determine what you think are minor amendments, and you can define them. So if it is something fairly small, that you don't have to go through that kind of really complex process, and simply be probably a simple majority at the board level to decide that in fact that's the case. And that's a good compromise. Something else I wanted to mention, the growth strategy legislation includes 14 goals which represent the provincial interest in growth strategies. I'm not going to read them all out, but I do think I want to read some of them, because I think they'd be very germane to this audience in particular. Number 1 is avoiding urban sprawl and ensuring that development takes place where adequate facilities exist or can be provided in a timely, economic, and efficient manner. So that's the overriding one. Basically, there's a recognition that the model of cities just sprawling further and further out really doesn't work. And there's some really undesirable consequences of it. Some of the others include settlement patterns that minimize the use of automobiles and encourage walking, bicycling, and efficient use of public transit. Protecting environmentally sensitive areas. This one might be of some interest to Central Saanich. Maintaining the integrity of a secure and productive resource base, including agricultural and forest land reserves. Reducing and preventing air, land, and water pollution. And another one that probably is of interest to Central Saanich. Preserving, creating, and linking urban and rural open space, including parks, recreational areas, working farmlands, and natural areas. So that's in the regional growth strategy. That is supposed to be part of the long-range vision we create. To be honest with you, we have been somewhat successful, but there has been an awful lot of nibbling at the edges. And one of the problems has been the fact that, you know, this is a consensual process. You know, in my own municipality, we had the good fortune of, in 1968, a very visionary council under Hugh Curtis of the day, you may have heard of him, put in an urban containment boundary in 1968. Remarkable, remarkable. Very, very few people were doing that at that time in history. You know, it just wasn't happening. So when it came to the regional growth strategy, it wasn't as much of a deal for us because we already had that. You know, we had rural Saanich, we had urban Saanich, and we had a clear definition in between. Other municipalities didn't have that and weren't quite as comfortable. For example, in order to come in, the municipality of Langford, I guess the city of Langford, they like to say, made their urban containment boundary their municipal boundary. So Mount Finlayson is inside the Langford urban containment boundary. They're really happy about that because they felt it gave them leeway to do whatever they wanted. You could argue that from a regional point of view, that wasn't such a good thing because you could start putting developments helter-skelter way out from anywhere where it was logical to put density, and as a consequence you were going to lose some open spaces, you were going to lose some farmland, green spaces, and you were going to have some transportation problems. Anybody been up to Langford? No. Last while? I think you might have some transportation problems. You know, pretty predictable. Pretty predictable. I mean, where does traffic come from? It's not like we have, you know, traffic eggs that sprout now and then. You know, the traffic comes from the past land use choices you have made. So we had these kinds of compromises that had to be made with the urban, to get people to come together to have some sort of regional vision. So that gives a pretty broad overview, and I just want to say a few things now about the RSS that we're going to, some other provincial requirements, and some of the weaknesses and things we need to overcome. The RSS stands for the Regional Sustainability Strategy, and that's to be the new name for the next version of the Regional Growth Strategy. Because it is an attempt to recognize some very significant problems that have arisen, or at least arisen in public mind, since the last Regional Growth Strategy came about. And the most obvious one is climate change. In the early 2000s, people who knew were talking about climate change. For most people, the word had not entered the lexicon. No, and if you said climate change, they sort of said, well, is that tomorrow's weather or the next day's? It's there, and it's huge. You know, I've been pushing really hard at the CRD to say climate change needs to become the major filter for the regional sustainability strategy and for indeed everything we do. So that every single decision you make goes through that filter and says, is this the right thing to do to address that incredible global problem, you know, along with others. The province, by the way, has passed some legislation recognizing that problem and others. And now, while we have the other things that I've already read out to you, the 14 and the minimum content, we are also in our regional strategies supposed to deal with the BC Climate Action Plan and related climate change plans, Living Water Smart Plan, which looks at how can we make efficient use of water, particularly in areas where it's not readily available, BC Energy Plan, how can we take a more sustainable approach to the amount of energy we use? BC Transit Plan. How can we... BC Transit has a provincially mandated goal to accomplish a doubling of their ridership by 2020. That's what they're required to do. It's going to be very hard. And that has to become part of our regional growth strategy. BC Air Action Plan, and of course the Agricultural Land Reserve. And all of these things have to be folded in to this current version. It is a difficult thing. Because again, it is a process by consensus. And we already have some at the regional district directors who are kind of rubbing their hands together. Now we can get rid of this bloody RGS, this millstone on our neck, and we can really go to town. Do all the things we want to do. Unfortunately for them, if they can't agree on a new strategy, then the existing strategy remains in place by default. So we can't get worse. We can only get better, hopefully. But the big problem we face is getting the diverse councils again to get together and put on a regional hat and say, what do we have to do to make this region sustainable for the future? Plain and simple. How can we live together without running our stereo at full bore at 3 o'clock in the morning? What can we do in our municipality that doesn't destroy the opportunities for the rest of the municipalities, that stays consistent with this long-term vision that we need to have for our future? We have some people who don't think that way. And our job is to convince them that you have to think that way. You know, it's not easy. Let me tell you. It isn't easy, but we need to do it. There's another thing we need to do, and that is we need to involve, and I really thank you for coming out tonight, because we need to get the public involved, and we need them to be aware of the importance of the choices that they make. When the regional growth strategy was first done, it was largely an in-house thing. And there were odd bits and things in the paper and so forth, but not that much. I can remember going to the last big public meeting. It was at the convention center. And this was the ultimate meeting for the public on this strategy. And I piled 3 people in my car, and we went down. And when we got there, we doubled the audience. Oh, holy man, are we in trouble? So, when the regional growth strategy came out, I mean, the average person, you said regional growth strategy, they say, well, what are we going to grow bigger kids? What's it? They didn't have a clue. And that was, by the way, the good thing about last term when we had the issues in Central Saanich, and much larger, really, to be honest, the issues out in Wandafuka, Marine Trail, because a lot of people began to understand there was a regional growth strategy and why it was important. We need to find ways to get the public aware of it, to let them recognize the importance of choices, and to let them recognize the consequences of various choices. Now, there are some very good tools. There is one that I've been trying to get the CRD to use, and I hope they will. It's called MetroQuest. And it's a computer simulation. And you take the factors that you're concerned with, you put them in, and you look and say, okay, here's the choices. Where do you want to put your growth? And I remember they did this for Vancouver area, Metro Vancouver. And people could say, well, I'd like to do this, I'd like to do this, I'd like to do this, and it would wait for about 10 seconds and flash up. Here's the consequences. You know, and for example, you would have these maps. Here's the existing Vancouver. Do you want to continue having everybody in single-family houses and expanding the number of single-family houses as you grow and so forth? Yes, I do. Here's the consequence. The Fraser Valley disappears. Oh, don't think I want the Fraser Valley to disappear. So that, you know, that tool, you can put it on computers so that anybody can sit down at home, go to the library, and they can play. And they can see the choices they make, what happens to the region as a result, and they can decide whether or not that's good. That kind of thing can happen, and we need it to happen. We need to, and what they did in one city where they used that, they would run a Sunday supplement in the newspapers. Here's all the choices this way, and here's what happens to our region. Do you like that? And in many cases, yes. God, no, I had no idea. So we need that type of thing with the public. We have very good computer modeling software that can show you, if you make certain land use choices, what's going to happen to your transportation system. For example, if we don't do some changes, the Trans-Canada Highway from Langford to borders of the city of Victoria becomes a rather slow-moving parking lot. You know, it just becomes completely congested. The average trip for people moving around the region, if we don't make significant changes, will at least double in the time it takes you to get places if you're doing it by car. That's a huge quality of life thing. It's a huge economic thing. So again, we need to show people. We need to get the average citizen saying, hey, this isn't just CRD Director's future, whatever. This is my future, and it's my kids' future, and we need them involved. So thank you. I hope that was informative. I'd be glad to take any questions.